So today I am redoing something I've already done, which is unfortunately something that happens. So I have here, this is the nut to the violin that I was working on here. I had already glued it in place, and then I realized that I had forgotten to do something that's a lot easier to do before you actually glue it in place, and that is to just slant the side that is the string side to slant that side down a little bit. It does two things. One, it makes it not have such a drastic angle over the nut, and it also just makes it look a lot more elegant. So I'm taking this opportunity to show you what it's like to fit a nut. Well, okay, the nut is already fit. I fit it and glued it, but so basically you take square and you plane each side until you get a square, there's no light that comes either underneath or on that side either. So you have two flat surfaces and they need to be at a 90-degree angle to each other. Or if they're not 90 degrees, they have to at least match what this is. And if this is 90 degrees, well, that makes everything a lot easier because 90 degrees is um, a much simpler angle to fit than something else. So when you use a plane, normally what you do is you take the plane to the work. And so you try to find a plane that's of the suitable size, so nothing too big, nothing too small. Um, but when your piece is this tiny, you can't really take a plane to that. So you take this to the plane. So what I do is I have the plane on its side just like that with the blade there. And then I simply take this side. It's so small it's hard to show you. And so basically, just as if you were cutting meat, you slide it along there and across like that. Now, since I want to make this angled, I'm going to lift up the backside. I'm going to lift up the backside just like that, and try to find that angle by doing that. If I suppose if I had a angled sander or something, that I would just put it up against the sander and angle it in like that, put a little finger pressure, but I don't want to use one. So I'm using my plane, and it's simply like that. It's not hard, it's not loud, and it's not dusty. Now we check to see how we're doing. So can we see this? All right, there we go. A little bit of light and shadow. So you can see there's a line now, and so this upper part has a bit of an angle to it. I'll keep working it until that line comes all the way down to the bottom. And then I'll know that it is fully angled. And of course, I'll see what it looks like on the instrument, but usually it comes out all right. Some people spot glue the nut with super glue, in which case you can work on it almost immediately. But I don't do that. I use I use the regular violin glue, the hide glue. If you've ever had the unfortunate experience to have your bridge fall down, which happens, you might bump your instrument, or especially in the wintertime in places where I am outside Montreal, it can get pretty dry in the winter. And when it gets dry, it affects the pegs, and it affects the pegs in the way that the maple, so the maple of the peg box shrinks, and when that happens, the hole gets ever so slightly bigger, but the peg also shrinks, and so that will get ever so slightly smaller. So you add those two things together, and if you don't regularly tune with the pegs, which most modern players don't because they have fine tuners, it can happen, and it happens to everyone, that suddenly the pegs just let go. They go boom, and all the strings come down. And it usually doesn't happen in the middle of playing, although it can. Usually it happens when you're not looking. So you'll show up in the morning to practice, and you'll open up your case, and all their strings will have fallen down, and the bridge will be off. And so if you know how to put the bridge back up, not a big deal. Not everybody knows how. So when I was working in the violin shop, that was a pretty common thing to have to do in the wintertime. People would come in with their violins and say, the bridge fell down, and so I put it back up, and then 90% of the time they'd be very happy with that. There's always that 10% that would they would complain to me about it. So why don't you just glue the bridge to the top of the violin? And I'm laughing because it was such a common thing. Like I said, 1 out of every 10 or sometimes more would have that comment. You have to explain it over and over again. The bridge is not glued to the violin. Neither is the sound post, for pretty darn good reasons. The bridge tends to warp, for one thing, if it's made out of, if the wood isn't as strong, and you carve it nice and thin, the way you would any bridge, then the bridge might warp. In which case, you'll have to take the bridge off, and at the very least, straighten it with a little bit of hot water and pressure. But sometimes they'll have to just make a new bridge. And that's very common. I mean, it's more common on cello bridges than on violin bridges, but for a violin bridge, becoming warped it can also be common, especially when you're dealing with the rental market. These are cheaper instruments, so the bridge and the instrument aren't necessarily connected. However, usually you will carve the appropriate quality bridge for the instrument. So for a rental quality violin, you'll have a rental quality bridge that you'll use to fit it with it. And those bridges, while they look the same to the naked eye, they're usually made out of wood that is not as strong. The wood itself is maybe not cut precisely on the quarter, which is what makes it strong. Or the wood might be a little more spongy, a little softer wood. Not all maple is made the same after all. Even in the same tree, sometimes the maple can be softer in one part of the tree than in another. So depending on the quality of the wood and the skill of the craftsman, sometimes you will carve bridges that are thicker. I've done that when I know that the bridge itself is not going to be so strong, and because I don't want it to warp, because that's just a pain in the butt. If you have to, let's say you're carving 1,000 bridges a year or 500 bridges a year, which is not uncommon in the rental space. You don't want to have 10%, 50 coming back a year with, or more. Sometimes it can be even more if you're still carving those cheap bridges to the professional standard, to the professionally standard thinness, then it can start to warp. So anyway, if the bridge comes off for whatever reason, sometimes the nut can come off, especially if it's attached with super glue. So here I have, let's get this shadow and light again. So maybe with where, yeah, here it is. So I have here my square. I'll try and line this up pretty well so you can see it. And here's my nut. And the nut goes up and it's square on that side. And then if I turn it around, you'll be able to see how it's angled. Let's see here. That's a little bit easier to see, I think. All right. So you can see that angle there. There you are. And that is exactly how long that took me to carve that. Not too long. Of course, it's longer than as if I was using a sanding machine. But this is actually it's a much cleaner effect. You don't have the sanding marks going across or down. And I can stop precisely where I want it to. I can make it precisely to the angle that I want it to. And okay, so I'm not going to lie. Maybe the only reason I could do this so quickly is because I do have a lot of experience in doing this sort of thing, but it is not one of the more difficult things to do on the instrument. It just takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of paying attention. Yeah, there we are. So now I have to glue it onto there. And once it's glued, fit a teeny tiny clamp. I have a story about these clamps too. Every shop I'd ever worked at had a slightly even smaller clamp than this, and we would use it to clamp on nuts and stuff. And then I was out on my own. I didn't have a clamp like that, so I would just hold it. And finally, I got tired of doing that, and I went out to buy these clamps. And I couldn't find the clamp that was actually the size I was used to, which is a little bit smaller. They've gotten a little bit larger over the years, and they're also pretty expensive. I think I bought two, and it cost something like $25 or something. Of course, those are Canadian dollars, so who knows what the real value is. But yeah, they're not cheap. They were a lot more expensive than I was expecting. I was expecting maybe $6 or $8, not 25. But anyway, I bought them now. I'm perfectly happy. So I'll glue that on and wait a few hours and come back and shape it. So in the vein of cooking shows, prepared one for you, but here's one I made earlier, and I take it out of the oven, etc. So this nut has that angle, and it is glued. And so now the next step is to actually shape that shape, and the side shape, and the ever so slightly back shape. So a nut shape is not straightforward. Let's just put it that way. So it has it needs to be a certain height above the fingerboard, obviously, to have the strings not be sitting on the fingerboard. So it needs a certain amount of height, and then on top of that, as the strings come over the nut, they need to be directed down into the peg box. And to do that, this angle has the highest point next to the fingerboard, and then it comes away. In addition to that, there are two shapes on either side, and this shape should follow the fingerboard and then have a little half round type shape as it comes down. And then that meets up with a shape on the back side here, where this will be rounded up as a sort of not quite a lozenge shape, but it'll be a round shape. So there'll be this odd meeting of the two round points here. Round point. I mean, the two rounds will meet at the corner. And when you pay attention to all those things together, it makes for a very elegant nut that very few people actually notice, but I think if you were to be shown two violin nuts, one that was done like that I just mentioned, versus one that was just slapped on and had the correct height and everything, but nothing else, you would see the difference. One is just much more elegant. So this nut and the saddle as well, I made out of bone on this violin as an experiment to see if it was possible. Now I haven't heard it yet. Obviously, it's not set up. There's not even holes for the pegs yet, even though it's violin number one. So I don't know what the sound difference necessarily is. My instinct is that it will have a brighter sound, which may be beneficial for a violin that is that the violin itself might have a darker sound. Like, I don't know what kind of sound this has. I have no idea. The other thing it does is it is decorative. When not everyone has a white nut and saddle. A lot of Baroque instruments do. A lot of original old instruments do, but those have been made out of ivory, and ivory is no longer allowed. And part of me is very sad, and part of me is very happy, because part of me that's happy naturally would be the part that feels for elephants and animals and the world in general. You don't want these beautiful creatures to die just for a bit of decoration. That's wrong. On the other side, in the 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries, I don't know if maybe probably before as well, there were great carvers who could do great things in ivory. If you go to museums, especially museums in Europe that are connected with royalty, like if you go to the Art History Museum in Vienna, for instance, they have a huge collection of ivory carving, and they're just out of this world. What do you want to say? They're just amazing, and I am told that ivory is quite pleasant to carve. I will never find out, most likely. I'm not planning to ever find out. Let's just put it that way. If I were to somehow be given a piece of antique ivory, for one thing, I would never be able to sell it, no matter what I did with it. But yeah, I guess I would try to carve something in that ivory, or make, pieces like this, maybe an inlaid fingerboard with ivory. There's a lot of Vildagamba fingerboards that are inlaid with ivory, or Vildagambas that have an ivory lining around the edges. I would love to try that, but I do not want it to come at the expense of the life of an elephant. These animals are rare, and they are very intelligent, and they're very majestic, and you don't want to see that happen. So I'll try my hand at bone. I suppose part of you might say, well, what difference? It still comes from an animal. Yeah, but so do gut strings and those things. But at least cows are grown for that purpose. They're not endangered. And it's still, if you're coming at it from an animal protection or animal sympathy point of view, then that's also not, it equates to the same thing, I suppose. But I eat meat. A lot of people I know eat meat. A lot of people I know don't eat meat too. But I eat meat. I enjoy a good hamburger. So if I'm using a bone from a roast or something that I've eaten myself, I think that's okay. So basically, as you can see, I'm using I like this shape of file because since the tip comes down, since it has a tip and it's not just flat, you see the difference here between this and this. This can get into some pretty tight areas, whereas this sort of bump it around, and it's not so precise. And if your instrument is already varnished, you don't want to damage the varnish accidentally. That's just stupid. So I'm using this, and I'm only using the very tip so that the tip isn't coming so close to the violin. Although if I just use, if I just use the very end of it, that's also not so good because there's not so much surface area that there is to cut. So, about a centimeter back from the edge, it seems to be pretty good. Working like this without machines, well, here's the thing when you're using a machine. To get to this point at work at the violin shop, I would just use, like I said, one of these electric sanders. It's a disc sander. And I would just take this piece and put it up against the sander and back and forth until I get the shape I need. And I would have already marked with a pencil the height of the fingerboard, so I wouldn't go lower than that. But I would still need to do this last step by hand. But the fact that I'm doing everything by hand now, no machines at all, will, like I said, with the exception of a lathe, and I think in the next video I'm going to use a lathe because I need to make a button for the Baroque cello. So you'll see my teeny tiny lathe in the next video. But I think one advantage to working this way is the peace and the quiet, and also the meditative quality of this work. It's very repetitive. You're just making the same motions over and over again with very small increments of progression. And I like it, even if it's not so fast. See, we're getting closer. All right, I'm going to turn you off, and I'll come back when it's basically done to show you the result. Well, it's been about an hour, and so I've been working on the nut as well as the saddle. So I just wanted to show you how that came out. The top of the fingerboard is there, and the idea is that it continues through the nut and then it rolls down. And the top is smooth, and it slants down toward the peg box, and it's a little bit higher. Okay, so there's no hard rules about how tall the nut should be. However, I tend to make it about the thickness of the string. So it's going to be the thickness of an E string on the E side and thickness of a G string on the G side. And so for gut strings, it's going to be a little bit higher, just a smidge. I didn't really measure it. I just did it by eye. And then the back, you see how it has a curve on either side. And those two curves, let's see if we can get it. So those two curves meet. They meet there, and they sort of come up out of each other. So when you do it really well, it's really elegant, and when you don't take the time, it's less elegant. Nobody really notices, but it's for other violin makers to see him like, oh, he took his time. And then on the other side, the saddle's a little less dramatic. However, it is a Baroque saddle, not a modern saddle. So a modern saddle comes up over the height of the violin quite far. So it comes up over the height of the violin quite far. On a Baroque, it's a lot less. In fact, whatever original nuts there are, they tend to just be level, even with the top of the instrument, and it's just a piece of harder material, either bone or ivory or ebony, to prevent the tension of the tail gut from digging into the top of the instrument. So I actually made this point up a little bit, so again, to support that gut, but it doesn't need to be as high as on a modern violin, because the gut actually creates that height that you don't have on the modern violin, because the gut is underneath the tailpiece, whereas on a modern violin the gut is sort of in the middle of the tailpiece. So that's where I am on that. Now the final step of finishing off this nut is, let's turn this a little bit, there we are, is to make the slots for the strings. The strings need slots. Now the distance on a modern violin, it's pretty well set at about 6 1/3, 6 1/4. Sorry, 16. What is it? 16 1/3 is what I think a lot of people have. 16 1/3 millimeters distance between the top string and the bottom string. Baroque, it's going to be a little bit wider, so I'm going to put mine at 17 and see what that looks like. So I'm using these dividers, and I measure it off on my ruler. How does that look? It looks a little bit narrow on that particular fingerboard. And how about if I do 17 1/2? So it's 1 full millimeter wider than modern. Is it really 17 1/2? Yep, that's 17 1/2. So like that. And what I do, once I have that measurement, is I simply, let's see here. It's very awkward with the camera. I'm used to moving around very independently of anything. I need to look at it from this side. It's very important to get it centered on the nut. And to do that, I look down the length of the fingerboard to the bottom of the instrument, and also up into the peg box. It should all be centered. So make a little divot. Make a little divot. Now, is that even visible to me? Barely. It's barely visible. Let's try that again. So in case you're wondering, I am experiencing that bone is harder than ebony, because I don't need to press this hard on ebony to get a good divot. Okay. However, it sands up really nice and it files really nicely. Came out really smooth. I'm really happy about that. Now, I do have 2 sets of dividers because if you're doing a lot of instruments all at once, it's really handy to not be switching the measurement back and forth all the time. Especially comes into being handy when you're doing bridges, because a bridge, you'll set the outside and the inside you'll put all the 4 strings in, and you'll put it up, and it'll be too high, of course, hopefully. So you make it lower and lower and lower until it's correct. But if you had to, find that measurement each time, it just eats up so much time. As soon as I started using 2 sets of dividers, it became much easier, much quicker. So what is a third of 17? It's about what, 5 and a half, 5 and a third. Okay. So even though I've measured it off onto the divider, it's still not going to be perfect. In fact, I still can't really see it. I know it's there. There. And there. All right, so now with the pencil I made some marks. It's a little bit easier. There it is. Again, it's also because it's white, it's very hard to see any kind of markings. That was perfect. It's not always perfect like that the first time. Sometimes sometimes you really have to do a lot of trial and error to get that correct. Okay, I'm just going to mark that. Make it a little bit easier for me to see. So now I have, let's see if we can't get it to focus. I have 4 little marks. 1, 2, 3, 4. What I'm going to do next, I don't know if I find this to be a handy intermediate step, because of course to make the actual slots, I'm going to use a file, which I brought out and has disappeared. Now it's funny how tools vanish on your desk, even when there's very little on your desk. What the heck? Where did it go? Yeah, okay. So we're back. I had to find my little file. It was right here. I just didn't see it. So that's a little tiny little file, rat tail type file. It's very, very fine. It gets to be a very fine tip. But in order for that to not sort of slide laterally like that, so we don't want it to slide we just want it to go straight, not sideways. And something I found that really helps, nobody really showed this I don't think anybody showed this to me, but I just started doing it because it made sense. If somebody showed it to me, I do apologize, but I don't remember any particular lesson with anyone saying, you know what, do this and it'll help. So I cut that point, the little hole that I made with the divider, I cut that right in half with the knife, and I make a slice. It's not going to go down very deep, but it does make a teeny tiny slot, and even that small amount of slot is enough to keep my file from moving sideways. Okay. And then, not too, you want to be firm, but gentle. Because you don't want, again, you don't want it to go sideways. And it's very easy for that to happen. So the first couple of passes are actually quite light until I have a groove happening here. A little bit more light than that. Just can't have too much light because of the camera. The camera really washes out that white, the white of the bone. There you are. So again, you want it to go down into the peg box, but not go so deep that the string will be sitting on top of the fingerboard. But it does need to be about half the depth of a string, because the string doesn't want to go sideways either. You also don't want the string to be down inside of anything, because then it won't, it'll buzz or it won't vibrate correctly. You just want it to be held in place. All right. And again, what I'm looking for when I'm down here, I'm looking on the fingerboard side to see how deep my hole is, because I don't want it to be very deep. Again, about half the thickness of the string. And then I'm just going to do that for the rest. Okay, so now I have all 4 slots made in my bone, in my nut here. And last step, before I can really call it a day on this, is put a little bit of pencil marking right down the middle. And that's not so I can see it better. That is like a little bit of grease. The graphite from the pencil acts as a lubricant between the string and the bone. Even though the bone is probably very slippery, it feels very slippery. A little bit of extra lubrication goes a long way to preventing the preventing the strings from having undue wear and breaking too often. You know, strings will wear down, especially gut strings, which this is going to have. They wear with use, unlike metal strings, which they can wear, but I mean, gut is just an organic material, and it can actually come apart, and because it's always under tension, and if you're always touching it in the same spot, it'll wear from the friction with your finger, but also from the acids in your sweat. So if we can prevent the nut from adding to that, the cost of replacing strings, then it's much better. All right, well, I think that's going to be it for this one. I'll catch you next time when I'll have my lathe out, and I will be making an end button for the Baroque cello. Thanks. Talk to you later.